The Galactic Council starved humanity for 9 days, then finally saw it for the first time. The chamber design specifications used the word recalibration for what a waiting room does to a man. Convocation Hall Urine Keth, published in the third governance cycle of the Deliberative Concord, Section 4, Subsection 9. Supplicant holding spaces should produce postural recalibration prior to testimony. The architects had thought carefully about this. The ceiling of antechamber Keth 4 was 2.7 meters. The new humanitarian compliance guidelines specified 3.1. The update had not yet been made. No warning had been posted about the ceiling. No explanation was offered for the single chair. No one had told Dr. Cale Vaughan, 68 years old, retired, that the room was designed to remind him of something before he spoke. He finished the last third of a flatbread he had brought from the transit vessel. He set the cloth-wrapped compass on the chair beside him, as though the seat were already taken. He sat with his back straight and read the acoustic specification plaque beside the chamber entrance. The plaque read, "Voices within Convocation Hall Urine Keth return to the speaker at 4% diminished volume." This is a design specification. It encourages measured testimony. Dr. Vaughan read it twice. Then he looked at the ceiling. Across the anteroom, Thayer Jr. filing clerk Farathi, 3 months posted, secondary eyelid already moving left to right in a slow, deliberate sweep, wrote in his intake log. Personal item, cloth-wrapped, non-functional in session, placed as though expected to wait. He paused, he added, "I filed this under miscellaneous personal effects. I'm not certain this is correct. Stay with this one. Some things happen in rooms that the rooms aren't built to hold." The chamber above, Convocation Hall Urine Keth, Deliberative Tier 3, was where the Galactic Council had processed 9,101 sessions. Without once invoking the humanitarian review mechanism it had written into its own regulations 300 years ago. It was where 312,000 people under nutritional restriction had been converted, 6 weeks prior, into a procedural line item. It was where Dr. Cale Vaughan was about to be item 14. He had 9 minutes before they called him up. He asked Thayer one question. How many people are currently under the restriction order? Thayer confirmed the number from his intake sheet. Vaughan nodded. When was notification sent to them? Thayer checked. 14 minutes before the session opened, sir. Vaughan said 14 minutes. Not as a complaint, not as an accusation. The way a man says the result of a measurement he already expected but needed confirmed. Thayer's secondary eyelid swept left to right again. He looked back at his log. He had been writing in the standard 40-word session intake format every working day for 3 months. He wrote 67 words about the next 4 minutes. He did not notice the difference until he submitted the log that evening. 41 minutes later, on the other side of the intake door, Sir Athvin's hands were flat on the presiding bench. He had not stood up. The recess had been called 4 minutes ago. When a presiding authority called a recess, they stood. This was not written anywhere in the Deliberative Concord's procedural code. It did not need to be. In 9,100 sessions, it had never been necessary to write it down. No explanation had been given for the recess. No delegate had spoken since it was called. No one in the chamber had moved toward the exit. Thayer, from the filing station at the chamber's east wall, wrote, "The presiding chair's George banding shifted approximately 0.3 seconds after the number was confirmed. I noted this because I did not know what else to write. The shift color is a gray-amber intermediate. I do not have a classification for it." He paused, his eyelids swept. He added, "The session has been in recess for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Standard recess duration for procedural matters of this tier, 3 minutes. The presiding chair has not moved. I am filing this observation. I do not have a category for this either." Across the chamber floor, Dr. Cale Vaughan stood exactly where he had been told to stand. He had not been told he could sit. He had not asked. 42 minutes earlier, which is to say, 1 minute before item 14 was called, item 13 had been a shipping rights dispute between 2 mid-tier species over a contested mineral corridor in the Bren system. The document that contained the shipping terms and the document that contained item 14 were the same weight in Therv's hand when he carried them to the data station. He had noted this without meaning to. Item 13 had taken 11 minutes. The presiding authority had asked 4 questions, all procedural, all answered without pause. The motion passed 6-3. Sir Ethven marked his left armrest. Therv watched him do it, the thin parallel line, cut by the edge of a citation stylus, added to 9,100 others. At this distance, the marks did not read as number. They read as texture. Item 14. The intake clerk, not Therv, a different clerk at the main podium, read the transfer terms at the same pace as the shipping terms. A retired xenohydrology specialist, one Dr. Cale Vorn, formerly of the Haleth Resettlement Institute, was to be reclassified as a compelled technical consultant at the request of the Terran Compact delegation, contingent on continuation of the nutritional restriction order and subject to review in 18 months. The document did not note that he was 68. The document did not note that he had spent 31 years mapping subsurface water access for agricultural settlements on humanity's second atmospheric colony. The document noted his specialist classification, his current non-affiliation status, and the transfer fee, which was paid to an institutional fund, not to him. Sir Ethven looked at the document. His 4-digit hands rested in their default curl on the bench surface, a curl that, Therv had learned, opened only when the chair was issuing a formal ruling. They did not open. He read at the calibrated pace he used for everything. The chamber acoustics were not in effect at the dais level. His voice did not return to him diminished. Only the speaker's podium produced that effect. He reached the end of the transfer terms. Confirmation of acceptance, he said, standard language. The room expected the word. Dr. Vorn, standing at the speaker's podium in the chamber floor, adjusted the cloth-wrapped compass slightly on the lip of the podium surface. A quarter turn. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I have a question first, if the bench permits." Therv's eyelid closed. Sir Ethven looked at him. "The bench permits. Of the 312,000 people currently under the nutritional restriction," Vorn said, "how many are under the age of 14? The room did not change visibly. No delegate shifted. Sir Ethven did not move. What happened was smaller than any of that. A pause, 2 seconds long, while the presiding authority's gaze moved from Vorn to his data clerk, who moved immediately to the supplementary impact file attached to the restriction order. The file had been attached 6 weeks ago. It had not been opened in this session. Therv wrote, "There was a pause of approximately 11 seconds while the supplementary impact data was retrieved. I noted that the file was attached to the original restriction order and had been available for the full session. I do not know if this is relevant. I filed it anyway." The data clerk read the number into the chamber microphone. 94,000. Vorn nodded. He said nothing else. The document had treated the 312,000 as a line item. The 94,000 were inside that number children, all of them under 14, and the room had not been told. Or rather, the room had been given the information, filed it correctly, and not opened it. These were not the same thing, but they were close enough that the difference lived somewhere between the 2 clauses of the same sentence, and Therv would spend the rest of the shift deciding whether to write that down. He wrote it down. He used 43 words, where he normally used 8. The data clerk, having read the number, did not speak again. Sir Ethven's banding shifted 0.3 seconds after the number landed. This was not a decision. The Alun exoskeletal ridging along jaw and crown responded to emotional load involuntarily, a fact documented in the Conquered Species Registry, which Therv had read during his first week of posting and filed under background reference, which was not a category that required follow-up. The banding moved from its standard amber through a brief, uneven gradient into the gray-amber intermediate that Therv now had no classification for. It did not settle. It stayed intermediate. Sir Ethven said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Procedural recess, 5 minutes." He did not stand up. The session marks on his left armrest, 9,100 of them, each one a thin line cut at the close of a session, did not yet have a new addition. He had not made the mark. He had never, in Therv's 3 months of observation, called a recess before making the mark. Thayer looked at the armrest. He looked at Sir Ethven's hands. He looked back at his log. He wrote, "He has not made the mark. I do not know if this means anything." The other council members did not leave either. This was the second thing that had never happened. 2 of them consulted documents. 3 conferred in low tones at the far end of the bench. All 8 of them kept Sir Ethven in their peripheral vision, the way Thayer had learned that people look at something they are not sure is safe to look at directly. Dr. Vorn stood at the speaker's podium. He did not look at the council members. He did not look at Thayer. He looked at the presiding bench, not at Sir Ethven's face, but at the surface of it, the way Thayer imagined a man looked at a terrain feature he had already calculated, waiting for the thing he had already worked out was going to happen. The document read Item 14. The chamber processed Item 14. Sir Ethven had moved on from 9,100 items before this one. The recess was in its second minute. Thayer's eyelids swept left to right, then right to left, then left to right again. He noted in his log that this had happened and that he was uncertain whether it was relevant. He decided it was relevant and left it in. The room was built so that you would feel yourself getting smaller as you spoke. Vorn had spent 31 years in terrain that had no interest in whether he felt small or large. He had mapped water access points under surfaces that did not care what he thought of them. He had written field reports in conditions that required the same precision regardless of how the conditions felt. The room had spent 22 minutes attempting to recalibrate him. The room had not succeeded. His voice at the speaker's podium had been the same volume as his voice in antechamber Keth 4, which had been the same volume as his voice when he asked Thayer about the notification time, which was the same volume as the voice of a man who had decided, somewhere in the 3rd or 4th year of field work, that rooms did not determine what a voice was worth. The chamber acoustics had returned his voice to him 4% diminished each time he spoke. He had not raised his volume to compensate. He had let the room do what it was built to do. The number he had said last, 94,000, was the only thing in the chamber that had not diminished when the room gave it back. It had been louder somehow on the return. Thayer did not know how to write this. He tried twice. He deleted both versions and wrote instead. The question was asked at normal speaking volume. The data was read at normal speaking volume. The room was very quiet afterward, which is different from being quiet before. 4 minutes and 30 seconds into the recess, Sir Ethven spoke. He did not use the chamber microphone. This meant the acoustic calibration was not in effect. This meant his voice was going into the room at full volume and returning to him at full volume. He was not performing for the record. He was not performing for the bench. He was speaking at the volume of a man talking to himself in a room that happened to have other people in it. He spoke without looking at Vorn. He said that 477 years ago, his species, the Alun Compact, then in its 3rd expansion cycle, had administered a resource reclassification in a territory they shared with a smaller species. 18,000 Alun displaced from subsistence water access. The paperwork had been correct, every form properly filed, every transfer term within the regulations as they existed at the time. He said he had been 63 years old when he processed the last form. He said he had not thought about it since. He was thinking about it now. No one spoke after he finished. Vorn stood where he had been told to stand. He had not been told he could approach the bench. He had not asked. He stood the way a hydrologist stands above a known water table, not demanding anything from the surface, just waiting for the pressure to reach what it was already going to reach. At 5 minutes and 0 seconds, Sir Ethven raised his hand. His 4-digit hand opened from its resting curl, not the movement that issued a ruling, something before that. Something that came from outside the procedural code, and he looked at it briefly, as though he had not decided yet what it was going to do. Then he placed it flat on the bench again. The recess was over. Thayer realized at that moment that he had been holding his citation stylus for the full 5 minutes of the recess, without writing a single word. He set it down parallel to the edge of his log sheet. His eyelid had been closed for, he checked his intake clock, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He had not noticed. He picked up the stylus. He looked at the presiding bench. Sir Ethven's banding had not resolved. The gray-amber intermediate was still there, unsteady at the edges, the kind of color Thayer associated with a process that had not finished but was close. The recess was over. The chamber was waiting. Sir Ethven raised his hand, not the ruling gesture, something older than that, and the chamber went still in a way that was different from the stillness of the recess. The recess had been the quiet of a room waiting. This was the quiet of a room that had understood something. He said, "The bench will hear a motion." Thayer had his stylus ready. He had been holding it ready for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. His log was open at the correct entry field. Everything about his posture was correct. His secondary eyelid swept left to right, and he wrote nothing for 6 seconds because the motion Sir Ethven was about to raise was not in any of the standard motion categories, and part of Thayer's mind was already cycling through the filing taxonomy, trying to find where it would go. It would not go anywhere he had yet used. The delegate from the Brenneth Compact, third chair from the left, looked up from his documents. He had been looking at the documents for the full recess. He had not been reading them, Thayer could tell because the page had not turned once, but he had been looking at them, which was a different kind of work. Sir Ethven's hands came fully open on the bench surface. Not the curl, not the ruling position. Open, flat, the way a person's hands go when they have stopped performing what their hands are supposed to do. He said, "Humanitarian Review, Regulation 7, Subsection 12, Suspension of the Nutritional Restriction Order pending full impact assessment. The motion is before the bench." No one moved. The 4 delegates at the far end of the bench, Thayer counted them in his log, then counted again, did not move. 2 of the 8 looked at each other. One looked at the ceiling. The last one, the Verath delegate, second chair, looked directly at Sir Ethven with the particular stillness of someone who had a procedural objection fully formed and was deciding whether now was the moment to give it air. It was not a dramatic silence. That was what Thayer could not figure out how to write. It was the silence of a room processing a calculation, not the silence of a room in shock. The calculation was this. Regulation 7, Subsection 12 had been invoked 4 times in 300 years. 3 of those invocations had been procedural tests, run during governance reviews to confirm the mechanism still worked. This would be the 5th invocation. It would not be a test. Dr. Vorn stood at the speaker's podium. He had not been told to sit. He had not asked. His hands were at his sides. The cloth-wrapped compass was on the lip of the podium where he had placed it, and he was not looking at it or touching it. He was looking at the presiding bench with the face of a man who had said the one thing he came to say and was now prepared to wait as long as the room required. The Verath delegate said, "On procedural grounds, I note that the supplicant has not completed the confirmation of acceptance required under Item 14. Sir Ethven said, "Noted." He did not say anything else. The Verath delegate looked at the bench surface. He said, "I will be filing an objection." Sir Ethven said, "You may." The vote took 3 minutes. 8 for, 5 against, all 5 on procedural grounds, all 5 objections properly filed, all 5 noted in the record. None of them changed the outcome. There was no argument. There was no debate. There was only the 5th invocation in 300 years, past 8 to 5, logged at session minute 22, 14 seconds, by a clerk who had been posting for 3 months and who would later submit a shift log entry of 412 words about a session that the standard format allotted 40. Vorn was reclassified, voluntary consultant. The distinction under the Concord's procedural code was equivalent to free. He did not immediately move. Thayer watched him. His log entry for this moment was 4 words. He did not leave. Then he crossed them out. Then he wrote them again. Vorn reached out and picked up the cloth-wrapped compass from the podium lip. He did not unwrap it. He held it at his side, the cloth worn at the fold the way cloth gets when the same hand has picked up the same thing in the same way for a long time. He looked once at the presiding bench, not at Sir Ethven, at the surface of the bench, at the 9,100 marks on the armrest, and then he walked toward the corridor door. Thayer opened a log field he had never used before. It was labeled, Presiding Officer Conduct. In 3 months of posting, he had read the label and never filled it in. There had been nothing to file. He put his cursor in the field and waited. The corridor outside Convocation Hall Urinketh was lit in amber spectrum, designed for Alun retinal banding. For human vision it ran slightly warm, slightly thick, the way light looks through old glass. There was no acoustic calibration out here, no plaque, no design specification about what voices do when they travel. Vorn's footsteps on the corridor floor returned to him at full volume. He did not notice this consciously. He was walking at the pace he used for field survey work, deliberate, not fast, the pace of someone who had learned that ground covered correctly was worth more than ground covered quickly. The compass was in his left hand. He had not opened it. Behind him, the chamber door opened. He heard it, he did not turn. Sir Ethven walked through the door, not quickly, not with a purpose that showed, and came into the amber corridor. He was taller than the corridor's average specification, but not uncomfortably so. His banding had not resolved. The gray-amber intermediate moved at the jaw ridge, unsteady, a color that was still in the process of becoming something. He had never, in a session cycle, crossed into this corridor. Therv, watching through the filing station window, he had moved to it without deciding to, wrote in the presiding officer conduct field. Subject exited chamber following session close. Entered corridor east approach. This is the first time I have observed this. He stopped, he added, I believe this is the first time it has happened. They walked together, not side by side exactly. Sir Ethven's height put his eye line well above Vorn's, and his stride was longer, but he had shortened it without drawing attention to the shortening. They walked at the same pace. The amber light moved over both of them in the same way, which is to say it did not distinguish between them. 180 meters to the transit threshold. Vorn had counted the distance on his way in. He counted most distances on his way in and on his way out. It was a field habit. It had stopped being deliberate about 15 years ago and had become the way he moved through space. No one else was in the corridor. The chamber behind them had already moved to item 15. At approximately the 90-meter mark, Sir Ethven spoke first. He said 18,000, not as a number this time. He said it as a thing that had a shape. He said it and then he said what they had been called in the reclassification paperwork, relocated labor. 2 words. The paperwork had been correct, every form properly filed, every transfer term within the regulations as they existed at the time. The clean paperwork had not asked what the 18,000 would eat in the resettlement territory. It had not asked because it did not need to. It was clean paperwork. Vorn walked. He said, how old were you when you filed the last form? Sir Ethven said, 63. Vorn said, I am 68. Nothing else was said for about 30 meters. No accusation had been made, no statement of equivalence, no claim about what one thing meant in relation to another. 2 numbers had been placed in a corridor in order, with 30 meters of amber light between them, and whatever the numbers did to each other, they did without assistance. Therv, still at the window, wrote, I cannot see their faces from this angle. I can see that they are walking at the same pace. He paused, he added, I filed this under corridor conduct. I created this category 11 minutes ago. It did not exist before today. The transit threshold was 60 meters ahead. Sir Ethven's banding was doing something Therv could not see from the window. The angle was wrong, but he noted the time and the position, and left a blank in his log where the observation would have gone. He had learned in 3 months that a blank in the right place was sometimes more accurate than a word in the wrong one. Vorn's pace did not change as the threshold approached. He had been told, in the pre-session intake notes Therv had given him in antechamber Keth 4, that the transit threshold marked the boundary of conquered jurisdiction, that crossing it meant he was in transit territory, which meant he was free to proceed to his vessel without further procedural obligation. He had read the note at the time with the attention of a man who already knew what it said and was confirming the details. He had folded the note into quarters and put it in his jacket pocket. It was still in his jacket pocket. He had not thought about it since. What he was thinking about, or rather, what his body was doing while his mind ran a few steps behind, was the field compass in his left hand. He had carried it to every hearing, every review, every institutional appointment for 11 years. He had never opened it in one. He had never needed to. He carried it because the weight was correct, and because it had belonged to someone who had known how to wait in difficult terrain without letting the terrain make decisions for him. He had not told anyone this. It was not the kind of thing that fit on an intake form. They reached the transit threshold. Sir Ethvin stopped. Counselors of the deliberative Concord did not cross the transit threshold during active session cycles. This was written down in the procedural code, subsection 41, governance boundary regulations, and had never needed to be enforced because no counselor had ever approached it. The regulation existed the way some regulations exist, as a record that someone had once thought it necessary to forbid something, which said something about the kind of person who had been consulted when the code was written. Sir Ethvin stopped at the threshold line. He did not say anything. Vorn stopped beside him for a moment. He looked at the transit hall beyond, wider than the corridor, the amber light giving way to white, and then he looked back at the threshold. He put the cloth-wrapped compass in his right hand. He turned to face Sir Ethvin. Sir Ethvin's 4-digit hands had returned to their resting curl, not the ruling position, not the open flat position from the chamber, the resting curl of a man who had finished a thing and did not yet know what posture came after it. His banding was still not resolved. Vorn said nothing. There was nothing left that needed to be said in this corridor. The accounting had been made, not balanced, not closed, but made, which was different from the alternative, which was to leave the corridor without making it. He had spent 31 years in fieldwork long enough to know the difference between a measurement that was final and a measurement that was simply the most accurate one currently possible. He turned and crossed the threshold. No warning, no declaration, no mercy asked for, and none given, just a man with a cloth-wrapped compass crossing into the transit hall where the light was white, and the floor was different material, and the sound of his footsteps changed. The transit hall was large and mostly empty at this hour. He walked to the long window on the east wall, the one that looked out over the approach lanes, the docking architecture, the slow movement of vessels through the traffic grid. The light outside was not amber. It was not calibrated for any particular species. It was the light of open space filtered through standard transparency glass, which was to say it was whatever it was, with no design specification attached. He stood at the window. He held the compass in both hands, still wrapped, still closed. He looked at the approach lanes for a moment. Then he looked at the compass. Then he set it on the window ledge, carefully, the worn fold of the cloth facing up, in the way a person sets something down when they are not ready to put it away, but also not ready to keep holding it. Behind him, in the corridor, Sir Ethvin turned and walked back the way he had come. He did not say anything further. Neither did Vorn. The threshold was between them now, and it had always been between them, not as a boundary between guilt and innocence, or between old error and present reckoning, but as the ordinary line that marks where one person's territory ends and another's begins. On one side of it, the session had been logged, the mechanism had been used, and the motion was already referenced in the record. On the other side of it, a man was standing at a window with a field compass he had never once opened in an institutional setting. Therv submitted his log at the end of his shift. 340 words. He had gone back and counted. The standard was 40. He had used 340 without realizing. He reviewed the entry twice and did not remove anything. There was nothing in it that was inaccurate. There was nothing in it that exceeded the factual record of what he had observed. The problem, or rather, the thing that was not a problem but that had no category, was that the facts, listed in order, added up to something the standard format had not been built to contain. He submitted it without a review flag. No one in the filing chain questioned the length. This was itself a kind of answer. In the presiding officer conduct field, which he had created 11 minutes into the post-session window and had never used before today, he wrote, "Subject remained in session position for full recess duration, did not delegate, did not exit, did not stand when recess was called, invoked Regulation 7, subsection 12 at session minute 19, 41 seconds, exited into corridor east approach following session close, walked to transit threshold, returned to chamber at session minute 44, 8 seconds. I am filing this because I do not know where else to put it. In the transit hall, the approach lanes outside the window moved at their usual pace. A supply vessel crossed the lower grid heading outward. A smaller craft, registry lights blinking in the standard interval, held position near the docking arm before being waved through. The amber light from the corridor did not reach this far. Vorn stood at the window. The compass sat on the ledge, cloth worn at the fold, facing up. The light outside was not calibrated for anything. It simply continued,